You remember the coffee. It was the last normal thing. The cup felt strangely light in your hand. You chalked it up to a morning fog, a lack of sleep. You took a sip. Then you felt it in your feet. A phantom lift. A sense that the floor was not quite holding you down. The morning news was playing on the television. A reporter's voice, calm at first, began to tighten. You glanced outside. A leaf fluttered past the window, going up, not down. A child's red ball bounced once on the lawn, then kept rising. It rose slowly, steadily, until it was just a dot against the blue. That was when the screaming began. Not one scream, but a chorus. It came from every house, every street. It was the sound of a world coming undone. You stood up from your chair. Your feet left the ground for a second too long. The landing was soft. Too soft. A deep, primal terror gripped you. Something was wrong with the world's most basic rule. The rule that kept you from flying into the sun. Gravity was failing. It was not a flicker. It felt like a slow, deliberate theft. Someone, or something, was stealing the very weight of your world. Your coffee cup lifted from the table. It hovered for a moment, a brown orb of liquid held by surface tension. Then it drifted toward the ceiling. The TV flickered and went dark. The power grid was probably the first major casualty. You rushed to the door, fighting the strange new buoyancy in your limbs. Outside, the chaos was just beginning. Cars with sleeping drivers were lifting from the asphalt. A terrifying silence was falling. It was the silence before the storm. The great unmooring had begun. Everything not bolted down was now a threat. Mailboxes, garden gnomes, park benches. They all began their slow, silent journey to the sky. You saw your neighbor, a good man you shared beers with, clinging to his porch railing. His face was a mask of pure, uncomprehending fear. His wife was holding onto his legs, her own feet dangling inches above the grass. You learned the first new rule of survival. Hold on. Hold on to anything. You scrambled back inside and slammed the door. It was a useless gesture. The house itself groaned around you. Nails squealed as they pulled from the wood. You could feel the foundation straining, wanting to join the exodus. You grabbed the heaviest thing you could find, a cast-iron stove. You wrapped your arms around it as dust and picture frames began to orbit the room. You were an astronaut in your own living room, without a suit, without a ship. The pull was gentle at first. It was a persistent, tireless suggestion to rise. But it was growing stronger. You heard a deep tearing sound from the roof. Shingles were peeling away one by one. Through the new gaps, you saw the sky. It was no longer empty. It was filling with the stuff of human life. A river of cars, trees, and lost shoes flowed toward the heavens. It was a quiet, lethargic apocalypse. You knew you could not stay. The house was a trap, a coffin waiting to fly apart. You had to get outside, find something truly anchored, something connected to the planet's core. You let go of the stove and pushed off toward the door. You flew across the room in a clumsy, unpracticed glide. The simple act of moving was now a terrifying ballet. Every push was a commitment to a new trajectory. You had to get to solid ground, if any was left. The first days were a blur of terror and motion. The sky was no longer blue. It was a churning, clogged artery of debris. Houses, stripped to their frames, tumbled slowly, end over end. Forests rose into the air like lifted carpets. Entire lakes ascended as wobbling, spherical masses of water. The world was a snow globe someone had shaken with infinite violence. And you were just another flake inside it. Survival was a matter of trajectory. It was a brutal game of cosmic billiards. You learned to catch things. A floating piece of rooftop became a raft. A drifting telephone pole became an anchor. You pushed off one object, aiming for another. You learned to judge speed and rotation in a three-dimensional battlefield. There was no up or down anymore. There was only away from the planet, and hopefully, toward something solid. You saw others trying to survive. Tiny figures clinging to the wreckage of their lives. Some formed small islands of debris. They lashed floating cars together with power lines. They created makeshift nets to catch supplies. Humanity was a scattered tribe of shipwreck survivors, adrift on an ocean of air. You even saw a dog once, paddling frantically in a floating sphere of pond water. It was the single most heartbreaking thing you had ever witnessed. It was also a sign that life, in its stubbornness, was still fighting. You caught a ride on what was once a school bus. It spun lazily, its yellow paint a beacon in the gray chaos. Inside, you found a handful of other survivors, strangers united by the same impossible circumstance. You shared no words. You only shared the view from the broken windows, a view of a world being disassembled piece by piece. The ground itself was now a distant, patchwork ball, and you were rising away from it, with everything else. Life on the tether became the new normal. Humanity, with its relentless need to build, created new cities. We gathered the largest pieces of wreckage. We anchored them to the deepest mountains with colossal cables. These were the tethered cities, sprawling islands of concrete and steel dangling over the abyss. New York's remnant skyline was tethered to the Rockies. The Great Pyramid was an anchor for a city of 10,000. You found a home on a platform called Catch. It was built from the remains of a dozen shopping malls. Life here had new rules. Up and down were directions, not destinations. You learned to walk with magnetic boots. You secured all your belongings with clips and cords. A dropped fork was a lost fork, doomed to a slow fall into the clouds below. A moment of carelessness could send you drifting into the void. The old world was a memory, a story told to children. Children who had never felt true weight. They were born in the float. You watched them navigate the tethered warrens with an ease you envied. For you, every step was a conscious effort. For them, it was instinct. They played games in zero gravity, their laughter echoing in the vast emptiness. They were a new kind of human, adapted to a world that had tried to throw them away. But even in this strange new life, fear remained. The tethers groaned under unimaginable strain. Sometimes, a cable would snap. An entire district would break away, drifting silently into the dark. Alarms would blare, a stark reminder of your precarious existence. You were living on a leash held by a planet that no longer wanted you. You often looked up, or was it down, at the Earth, wondering what had happened, and who was to blame. The children of the float were a marvel. They were born into a world without a floor, a world of ropes, nets, and open air. You watched them from your small apartment window on Catch. They moved like dancers, leaping from handhold to handhold. They saw 3 dimensions where you still saw 2. Their laughter was different too, lighter, unburdened by the memory of solid ground. To them, your stories of the old world were fairy tales. The idea of rain falling down was bizarre. The concept of an ocean that stayed in one place was a fantasy. You tried to explain what it felt like to run on a beach, to feel the sand give way beneath your feet. They would listen with polite curiosity, the way you might listen to a story about dragons. They could not comprehend the sheer force of a planet holding you close. You saw the difference in their bodies. They were taller, more slender. Their muscles were designed for pulling and pushing, not for bearing weight. Their hearts were stronger, working harder to pump blood without gravity's help. A doctor on Catch once joked that you grounders were a dying breed. It wasn't a very funny joke. He was probably right. This new generation was the future of humanity. Their minds were different too. They thought in terms of vectors and momentum. They could solve navigational problems in their heads that took you a computer. They were humanity's next evolution, forged in the crucible of loss. Sometimes you felt a bitter jealousy. They had not lost anything. They had been born into this. But then you would see one of them, a small child, gazing out at the distant earth, a look of longing in their eyes for a home they never knew. And you knew they felt the loss too, just in a different way. Then came the whispers. They started as faint static on the communication channels, a ghost in the machine that linked the tethered cities. At first, the engineers dismissed it as interference. Debris from the great unmooring still cluttered near orbit. But the signal was persistent. It had a pattern. It was not random noise. It was a message. Experts from every remaining nation worked on it. They filtered the static, amplified the faint rhythm. It took months. The signal was weak, ancient. It seemed to travel across unimaginable distances. It was a whisper from the void, a whisper that spoke of what had been done to you. The day they finally decoded a piece of it, a message went out to all the cities. An audio file played over every speaker. It was not a language of words. It was a language of mathematics, of pure star science. A series of tones and frequencies that described a force, a manipulation of the universe's fundamental laws. It was a blueprint. The blueprint for stealing gravity. The whispers were not a cry for help. They were an echo. The echo of the weapon that had been used against you. You listened to the recording, a haunting melody of loss. For the first time since the unmooring, humanity had a clue. This was not a natural disaster. This was not a random act of a cold universe. This was an attack. Someone had pointed a weapon at your home and pulled the trigger. The whispers from the void gave you more than just answers. They gave you a target, a direction for your rage. The quest for survival was over. The quest for justice had just begun. The experts called it the gravity ghost. It was a faint, lingering signature, a trail of breadcrumbs left behind by the thieves. The same force described in the decoded whispers. It was a subtle distortion in space-time, an echo of the stolen force. It was almost undetectable. But humanity had gotten very good at listening to the quiet. We had spent years straining to hear each other across the void. A mission was formed, the Trace Finder Initiative. Its goal was simple, to follow the gravity ghost to its source. It was a shot in the dark, a desperate gamble based on a whisper and a prayer. But it was the only shot you had. You volunteered without a second thought. The memory of that first day, of the world rising up, was burned into your mind. You needed to know who did it. You needed to look them in the eye. The selection process was brutal. They needed people who were not just physically adapted to zero gravity. They needed people with a certain kind of mind, people who could remain calm while tumbling through the infinite, people who could hold on to their sanity when the only thing outside was the endless night. Your years of navigating the debris fields had prepared you. You made the cut. You were assigned to a scout ship, the Pathfinder. It was little more than a cockpit and an engine, bolted to a sensor array of incredible sensitivity. Your job was to fly ahead of the main fleet, to be the tip of the spear. You and your crew would follow the Ghost, mapping its faint trail. It was the most dangerous job of all. You were the canary in the cosmic coal mine. But the risk felt right. It felt like purpose. You were no longer just a survivor clinging to wreckage. You were a hunter on the trail of giants. The day you left Catch was somber. There were no cheering crowds, just the silent prayers of a species betting everything on your success. As your ship pulled away, you saw the tethered cities recede, fragile lights against the black. Home. You looked ahead, into the star-dusted darkness where the trail led. There was no fear, only a cold, hard resolve. You were going to find the end of this road. You were going to bring back the weight of the world. To chase a ghost, you needed a new kind of ship. The old rockets were useless, designed to fight a gravity that no longer existed. Humanity needed to think differently. We needed to build for a universe where the only rule was inertia. We needed to forge the momentum fleet. These were not elegant vessels. They were brutal machines. They were hammers designed to smash their way through the void. The ships were built around a single concept: pure kinetic force. Their engines were massive, linear accelerators. They fired slugs of super-dense material at near light speed. The recoil was what propelled the ship forward. Every course correction, every maneuver, was a controlled explosion. Flying one was like riding a barely contained earthquake. They were loud, violent, and utterly terrifying. They were perfect. You trained for months in the simulators. You learned to handle the crushing acceleration. You memorized the firing solutions for the kinetic cannons. These were not just engines. They were also your primary weapons. In a world without gravity, a pebble traveling fast enough could shatter a moon. The Momentum fleet was an arsenal of very large, very fast pebbles. You learned to kill with pure speed. The flagship of the fleet was the Indomitable. It was a monster, a city block of engines and armor plating. It was humanity's rage given form. Smaller destroyers and frigates flanked it. And then there were the scout ships like yours, the fast, nimble pathfinders. You were the eyes and ears of the fleet, the first to see the enemy and the first to die. A fact the commanders never tried to hide. It was a part of the cold, new math of war. The day the fleet was finished, it was a sight to behold. Hundreds of ships, forged from the wreckage of the old world. They hung in the void around the tethered cities, a forest of dark metal and glowing engines. It was a declaration, a statement written in steel and fire. We were not victims anymore. We were coming for our property. We were coming to get our gravity back. The fleet was ready. The trail was clear. The hunt began. You were weeks into the deep void when they appeared. Your Pathfinder was running ahead of the fleet, chasing the faint gravity trail. The sensors screamed, a distortion in space-time dead ahead. But this was not the faint ghost you had been tracking. This was a presence, massive, powerful. Your ship's computers struggled to make sense of the readings. It was as if a star had simply blinked into existence. Then you saw it, a vessel of impossible geometry. It was not made of metal, but of something that looked like polished obsidian. It absorbed the light of the distant stars. It was sleek, ancient, and silent. It hung in the void before you, a silent judgment. Your training took over. You sent a tight beam transmission back to the fleet. Contact. Unknown vessel. You prepared for a fight you knew you could not win. A channel opened. Uninvited. It bypassed all your security protocols. A voice filled your helmet. It was not spoken in a language you knew, but you understood it perfectly. The voice was calm and filled with an infinite sadness. It said, "We are the Elder Ones. We have been watching you. We know what you seek, and we are here to warn you." The voice explained. They were a race of stargazers, of historians. They had seen this happen before, countless times, to countless worlds. The beings you hunted had a name that echoed in the histories of 1,000 dead civilizations. The voice spoke the name with a cold dread. The Collectors, your enemy, had a name, and according to the Elder Ones, they were the death of worlds, a force of nature with a terrible, insatiable hunger. The Elder One, its voice a river of ancient sorrow, told you everything. It showed you images in your mind, not through a screen, but directly into your consciousness. You saw worlds like yours, green, blue, vibrant with life. Then you saw the Collectors arrive. Their ships were not vessels of war. They were instruments of harvest. They did not conquer, they consumed. You learned the Collectors' price. Their home star was ancient, dying, a cold, flickering ember in a forgotten corner of the galaxy. They had found a way to sustain it, a way to fight the slow death of their universe. They fed it. They fed it gravity. They would find a world, a young world with a strong gravitational pull, and they would harvest it. They would drain the very force that held the planet together. Your world was not special. Your suffering was not unique. To the Collectors, you were a resource. Your planet was a field of ripe fruit, ready for the picking. Your homes, your lives, your history. It was all just fuel for their distant, dying fire. The Elder One showed you the process. A colossal machine, an engine that created a gravity well so powerful. It siphoned the force from its target. That was the source of the trail you followed. The Star Thief engine, the Elder One looked at you, not with eyes, but with a feeling of profound pity. They told you to turn back. They said no one had ever faced the Collectors and survived. They were a law of physics, a final, unavoidable end. To fight them was to fight entropy itself. It was a war you were destined to lose. The Elder One even offered you sanctuary, a place for the last of humanity to live out its days in peace. Their logic was flawless. Their compassion was real. But they didn't understand humanity. They didn't understand that sometimes a punch that can't possibly land is the only punch worth throwing. The warning from the Elder Ones changed nothing. In fact, it hardened your resolve. Knowing the enemy's purpose made them feel less like gods and more like parasites. They were not an inevitable force of nature. They were just desperate, and desperation could be used against them. Humanity returned to the one thing it did best, turning a curse into a weapon. We began weaponizing nothing. The core concept was simple. The Collectors stole gravity. They manipulated the void. So would we. Our scientists and engineers worked feverishly. They studied the data from the Elder Ones. They analyzed the faint echo of the Star Thief engine. They realized that the Collectors did not destroy gravity. They moved it. They created channels and conduits in space-time, and any channel could be disrupted. The momentum fleet was refitted. The kinetic cannons were modified. Instead of firing dense slugs, they were calibrated to fire pockets of warped space-time, little bubbles of nothing. These void charges would travel along the same channels the Collectors used. Once inside the enemy's gravity field, they would collapse. The resulting backlash would be catastrophic. It was like popping a balloon inside an engine, a very, very big engine. You had to learn to fight all over again. The void charges were not conventional weapons. You didn't aim at a ship. You aimed at the space around it. You had to predict how the enemy's own gravity field would pull the charge in. It was a deadly form of celestial archery. It was also your only advantage. The collectors would never expect their own technology to be used against them. They saw you as primitives. They were about to learn that primitives are very good at throwing rocks, even if those rocks are made of nothing at all. The new strategy was called well cracking. It was dangerous. It was unpredictable. It was probably insane. But it was also beautifully human. We were going to fight a monster that ate gravity, and we were going to do it by feeding it poison. The mood in the fleet shifted from grim determination to a kind of fierce, manic optimism. You were no longer just seeking revenge. You were a pest control service on a galactic scale, and business was about to pick up. The first test of your new weapons came sooner than you expected. The gravity ghost trail grew stronger, more defined. The Pathfinder's sensors picked up a single, isolated signature, a collector harvester. It was smaller than the main engine, a scout ship of their own. It was testing the local space, sampling the remaining gravitational eddies of a nearby asteroid field. It was alone. It was the perfect target. The ambush was set with cold precision. The Indomitable and the main fleet hung back, silent and dark. A squadron of destroyers and your scout wing moved into position. You crept forward using minimal power, drifting on pure momentum. The collector ship was an ugly, asymmetrical thing. A tangled mass of conduits and collectors that pulsed with a sick, purple light. It hummed with stolen power. It was oblivious to your presence. The order came on a secure channel. A single word: engage. Your hands flew across the controls. You locked onto the space just ahead of the harvester. You fired. A silent, invisible bolt of nothing shot from your ship. You saw other void charges converging from the destroyers. They were ripples in the starlight, distortions moving at incredible speed. The harvester finally detected you. It began to turn, its movements slow and ponderous. It was too late. The void charges struck the harvester's gravity field. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the purple light on the enemy ship flickered. It stuttered like a dying fluorescent bulb. Cracks of pure white energy raced across its hull. The ship convulsed, shuddering violently. It did not explode in a fireball. It imploded. The stolen gravity within it collapsed, tearing the ship apart from the inside out. It folded in on itself until it vanished, leaving behind only a faint shimmer and a cloud of frozen gas. Silence. The comms channel was dead silent. Then, a single voice, the fleet commander, crackled to life. Target neutralized. A cheer erupted across the fleet, a raw, primal roar of triumph. It was the first time in a generation that humanity had screamed in victory, not in terror. You watched the space where the enemy ship had been. You had done it. You had killed one of them. It was not just a victory. It was a proof of concept. The gods could bleed. The victory over the harvester gave you a priceless gift. Data. The implosion of the collector's ship sent a resonance wave back down the gravity channel. It was a flare that illuminated the path ahead. For the first time, the trail to the Star Thief engine was not a ghost. It was a brightly lit highway. There was no more guesswork. No more chasing whispers. You knew exactly where you were going. The journey was long. It took you out of your familiar spiral arm of the galaxy, into a region of space that was older, darker. The stars here were sparse and red. The silence was deeper. You passed the skeletal remains of dead solar systems. Planets cracked open like eggs. Brown dwarf stars stripped of their energy. This was the Collector's feeding ground, a graveyard of worlds that had lost the war before it even started. Your Pathfinder was part of a constant forward screen. You and the other scouts flew in a wide net, ensuring nothing could surprise the main fleet. The mood was tense. The initial elation of your victory had been replaced by a grim understanding of the scale of your enemy. They were not just thieves. They were a galactic blight, and you were flying into the heart of their nest. Then, you saw it. It appeared on your long-range sensors first. A gravity reading that was so massive, so fundamentally wrong, your computer tried to flag it as an error. It was larger than a star, larger than a nebula. It was a wound in the fabric of reality. As you drew closer, its physical form resolved from the darkness. The Star Thief engine. It was a structure so vast it defied comprehension. A Dyson sphere not around a star, but around a singularity. A black hole that had been weaponized. Colossal conduits, each one the size of a moon, snaked out from the central sphere. They were pointed in a million different directions, at a million different worlds. You saw one of them glowing with a faint blue light, the channel that was still connected to Earth. It was the source of all your suffering, a machine built to drink planets, and you were flying straight into its mouth. The final battle would not be fought in open space. The Star Thief engine's gravity field was too powerful. The Momentum fleet would be torn apart before it got close. The plan was audacious and probably suicidal. You were going to fly down the throat of the beast. You were going inside the well, the energy conduit that linked the engine to Earth. It was the only way to get close enough to the core to use your void charges. Your squadron of Pathfinders was chosen for the first wave. You were the smallest, most nimble ships. You would be the tip of the spear that would pierce the monster's heart. The Indomitable and the rest of the fleet would follow, providing covering fire and engaging any Collector defenses that emerged. There were no grand speeches. The commander's final briefing was short and to the point. "Break it," he said, "or don't come back." You guided your ship toward the glowing blue channel. As you entered its influence, a strange thing happened. You felt a pull, a faint, familiar pressure. It was the ghost of Earth's gravity, the very force being siphoned away. It felt like a memory of home. Flying into it was like diving into a phantom ocean. The walls of the conduit were not physical. They were shimmering curtains of pure energy. Inside, the universe looked warped, distorted. Collector defense drones appeared. Small, insect-like ships that swarmed you from all sides. The battle inside the well began. It was a chaotic storm of light and motion. You dodged, weaved, and fired your void charges. You saw friendly ships get hit, vanishing in silent implosions. You ignored the fear. You ignored the loss. You focused on one thing, the core. It grew larger in your view, a pulsating heart of stolen energy. You were close now. So close you could see the intricate machinery of the engine's core. It was a maelstrom of power that made the stars themselves look dim. You lined up your final shot, all power to forward cannons. You ignored the alarms screaming in your cockpit. You ignored the enemy fire scoring your hull. You held the trigger down. You emptied your entire arsenal of void charges into the heart of the machine. Then you pulled away, praying you had done enough. The weight returned like a physical blow. One moment, you were weightless. The next, you were pinned to your seat by a crushing force. It was sudden, brutal, and absolute. The Star Thief engine, gutted by 1,000 void charges, had failed. The gravity it had stolen for a generation was released in a single, uncontrolled wave. The channel collapsed, and all of that stolen weight came rushing home. Your ship groaned under the strain. Alarms blared, not from enemy fire, but from structural failure. The ship was not built for this. It was not built for weight. Across the fleet, the same story unfolded. Ships designed for the void were being crushed by the very thing they had fought to reclaim. You saw the Indomitable, the proud flagship, buckle in the middle, its spine broken by the sudden return of physics. You managed to keep your Pathfinder together. You fought the controls, your arms feeling like lead. You turned the ship around. You had to see. You pointed your viewport back toward home, back toward the distant blue dot. The wave of gravity would hit them just as it had hit you. Suddenly, and without warning, a victory that felt like a sledgehammer. You thought of the children of the float, the generation born into weightlessness. They would be crushed by this. Their bodies were not ready. Their cities on tethers were not designed for this. The cables would snap, the platforms would fall. You had won the war, but the price of victory was a new kind of chaos. Humanity had reclaimed its birthright. But now, it had to learn how to stand all over again. The weight of victory was heavier than you could ever have imagined.